At 9:47 a.m. on March 31st, 1943, Second Lieutenant Owen Bagot watched his B-24 Liberator come apart in midair over the jungles of Burma, flames ripping through its fuselage as 13 Japanese fighters circled like sharks waiting for blood. Bagot was 22 years old, a newly minted co-pilot who had already flown 8 months of combat missions out of Pandwar, India. That morning, his bomber, part of the 7th Bomb Group, 9th Squadron, was one of 12 aircraft sent to destroy a railroad bridge near Pinmana, a vital artery feeding Japanese forces deeper in the theater. They never reached it. The attackers were Ki-43 Hayabusas, fighters of the 64th Sentai, climbing hard from airfields flanking the target. American crews called them Oscars. Light, agile, brutally effective in the hands of veteran pilots. The Ki-43s spotted the B-24 formation at 4,000 feet and pounced immediately. Inside Bagot's aircraft, chaos erupted. First Lieutenant Lloyd Jensen, the pilot, wrestled the controls as fuel tanks ruptured and fire raced along the wings. Oxygen bottles exploded, feeding the inferno with pure oxygen. The intercom went dead in an instant. Bagot couldn't shout warnings. He could only gesture. He pointed. "Bail out. Get out now." 19-year-old Sergeant Samuel Crossstick grabbed 2 fire extinguishers and climbed onto the narrow catwalk above the open bomb bay, fighting the flames while standing over nothing but sky. The fire swallowed the foam as fast as he sprayed it. The aircraft was lost. Jensen gave the order. Men began to jump. Bagot watched 4 parachutes blossom beneath the falling bomber, 4 fragile flowers opening in the violent air. He counted them, forcing himself to track every man as the B-24 exploded behind him, scattering burning fragments across the sky. Then he heard the sound every airborne soldier feared. A high-pitched whine, rising fast. The Ki-43s were diving again, not at the wreckage, not at the bombers. At the men. American intelligence had documented it. Japanese pilots sometimes strafed parachutists, killing airmen before they could be captured or rescued. The logic was simple. Dead men could not return to fight. Bagot watched in horror as 2 of his crew were cut down in midair, their parachutes shredded by cannon fire before they reached the ground. Bullets tore past him. One struck his left arm, grazing flesh. Blood spread quickly through his flight suit. Bagot made a decision in a fraction of a second. He went limp. He let his head fall forward. His arms hung slack in the harness. He became motionless, a corpse in the sky, hoping the enemy pilots would see only another dead airman and move on to living targets. The wind spun him slowly. Through barely open eyes, watching through slitted lids, Bagot saw one Ki-43 peel away from the others. The pilot was either curious or very thorough. The Oscar climbed slightly, just enough to regain lift, then curved back toward Owen Bagot. The Japanese fighter settled into a slow, deliberate circle, its pilot studying the American hanging motionless beneath his parachute. The aircraft's nose rose. Speed bled away. The Ki-43 hovered at the edge of a stall, barely flying, wings trembling in the thin air. The canopy slid open. The pilot leaned out, peering down at Bagot's limp body, searching for any sign of life, any movement that would betray a living man pretending to be dead. The distance closed to 20 feet, maybe less. Bagot did not breathe. His right hand hung slack against his thigh, exactly where it had fallen after he pulled the ripcord. Wrapped in his fingers was his Colt M1911, standard issue for Army Air Forces officers. 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. He had never drawn it in combat. Never imagined he would need it in the sky. Slowly, carefully, he raised the pistol. The Japanese pilot saw the motion. His eyes widened. Bagot fired. 4 shots. 4 sharp cracks ripped through the air in less than 2 seconds. The Ki-43's nose dropped instantly. The engine note changed pitch. The fighter slipped sideways, then rolled into a violent spin, falling away through 3,000 feet of open sky. Bagot watched as it tumbled downward, out of control, until it vanished beneath the treeline and the jungle swallowed it whole. Bagot was still falling, still bleeding from the graze wound in his arm, and the ground was rushing up fast. He hit in a rice paddy 3 miles northeast of Pinmana, slamming into 18 inches of water that drove him to his knees. He fought free of the harness, sucked in air, and pulled the pistol from its muddy holster. 3 rounds left. He looked up. 2 more parachutes were descending about half a mile away. Jensen and one of the gunners, though he couldn't tell which. The remaining Key 43s were no longer strafing. They climbed away to the northwest, returning toward their bases. Baggett counted them. 9 fighters. 4 were missing. He didn't know whether American gunners had hit them or if they had simply exhausted fuel and ammunition. He moved toward the tree line bordering the paddy. His arm throbbed, but the bleeding had slowed. He made it 20 yards before voices reached him from the jungle. Not Japanese. Burmese. 6 men emerged carrying rifles. Lee Enfields, likely captured when Singapore fell the year before. Local militia working with the occupation forces. Baggett raised his hands. The pistol was still in his right hand. One man pointed at it. Baggett dropped the weapon into the mud. They bound his wrists with rice rope and marched him east. Jensen joined the column 10 minutes later. Then Sergeant Cross Stick, the flight engineer who had fought the fire in the bomb bay. 3 Americans. 5 dead. Baggett did the math and forced himself not to think about the men cut down in their parachutes. The Burmese turned them over to Japanese army personnel at a garrison outside Pinmanna. The interrogation began immediately. Names, ranks, units, bases, targets, bomb loads, formation strength. Baggett gave only name, rank, and serial number. The interrogator struck him across the face and asked again. Baggett repeated the same 3 words. They separated the prisoners. Baggett was locked inside a bamboo cage, barely large enough to sit upright. No food, no water. By midday, the temperature climbed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The war for him was no longer in the sky. It had become something else entirely. Baggett could hear Jensen somewhere nearby, coughing in the darkness, but he couldn't see him. Night brought mosquitoes, thick and relentless, and the distant rumble of artillery to the north. The sound drifted across the jungle in low, muffled booms. The British were pushing back, maybe. Or maybe it was only wishful thinking, echoes magnified by hope. On the 3rd day, Japanese soldiers loaded the 3 Americans onto the back of a transport truck. The convoy moved south toward Rangoon, traveling only at night to avoid Allied air patrols. During the day, the trucks hid beneath trees or camouflaged nets. Baggett watched the jungle slide past through gaps in the canvas cover. Dense foliage. Occasional villages. Fires burning in the distance. He replayed the moment in the sky again and again. The Key 43 spinning downward. The pilot's face in that last second before Baggett pulled the trigger. Young. Maybe 20. Maybe younger. They reached Rangoon on April 7th. The guards marched them through the gates of a military prison on the city's eastern edge. The compound held roughly 200 prisoners, British, Australian, Indian Army, and a handful of Americans. Most had been captured during the fall of Burma 13 months earlier. They looked like walking skeletons. A British major, imprisoned since March 1942, stood in the exercise yard when Baggett arrived. The man stared at Baggett's blood-stained flight suit, the dried mud caked to his boots, the torn fabric at the arm where the bullet had grazed him. Word had already begun to spread. The prisoners whispered about the American bomber shot down over Pinmanna. They wanted to know what had happened above the bridge, about the fighters, the parachutes, the impossible story filtering through the camp. Baggett didn't fully believe it himself. The more he replayed the moment, the more unreal it seemed. A man hanging beneath a parachute. A pistol. For shots fired at a moving aircraft. The odds were absurd. Astronomical. He had seen the Key 43 fall. But had it crashed? Maybe the pilot recovered. Maybe Baggett missed entirely. Maybe the fighter had simply broken off the attack. The Japanese guards believed otherwise. On April 15th, 8 days after his arrival at Rangoon prison, guards pulled Baggett from his cell. Jensen and another American officer were marched alongside him across the compound and into the commandant's office. A Japanese major general sat behind a wooden desk. He commanded all prisoner-of-war facilities in the Burma theater. Years later, he would be executed as a war criminal for his treatment of Allied prisoners. The general studied Baggett for a full minute without speaking. Then he made an unexpected offer. He explained harakiri, the honorable death of a warrior who chose death over the shame of captivity. He described the ritual carefully. The posture, the blade, the proper cut. He offered Baggett a knife. The general did not speak with cruelty. He spoke with a strange, formal respect, as if addressing a fellow soldier who had demonstrated exceptional courage. Bagot declined. He had no intention of dying by ritual suicide. The general showed no anger, no disappointment. He simply nodded, dismissed the prisoners, and had them escorted back to their cells. But the encounter confirmed something Bagot had already begun to understand. The enemy knew what he had done, and they would never forget it. The Japanese knew exactly what had happened over Pinmana. They knew about the Key 43, and they knew who had brought it down. After the meeting with the general, the guards treated Bagot differently. Not better. The beatings continued. The starvation continued, but something had changed. There was caution now. They watched him more closely, isolated him more often, moved him between cells without explanation. In Japanese military culture, battlefield prowess mattered. Courage, even in an enemy, carried weight. What Bagot had done was not just unusual, it was unthinkable. A man firing a pistol from a parachute and destroying a fighter aircraft violated every expectation of air combat. That made him dangerous. By June 1943, Bagot's weight had dropped from 180 pounds to 140. Dysentery swept through the camp. 17 prisoners died in 3 weeks. The Japanese provided no real medical care, only occasional bandages and iodine. Food consisted of rice, thin vegetable soup, and whatever protein prisoners could scavenge: insects, rats, scraps of grass. Bagot developed beriberi, a severe vitamin deficiency. His legs swelled. His joints ached. His vision blurred. Standing for long periods became difficult. In September, the Japanese transferred Bagot and Jensen south to a new facility near Singapore. The journey took 4 days by rail and ship. 50 prisoners were packed into a cargo hold designed for 20. Heat, dehydration, and disease took their toll. 2 men died during the voyage. The guards threw their bodies overboard without ceremony. The Singapore camp was worse than Rangoon. Smaller cells, less food, harsher discipline. But it had one advantage: transients. Allied prisoners passed through regularly, bound for labor camps in Thailand and Malaya. New faces brought fragments of information, rumors, hints of how the war was going. On November 28, 1943, guards brought in a new prisoner, an American colonel, a fighter pilot shot down 3 days earlier while flying a P-51 Mustang over southern Burma. His name was Colonel Harry Melton, commander of the 311th Fighter Group. Melton had been shot down on November 25, escorting bombers over the Irrawaddy River Valley. A Ki-43 hit his aircraft with cannon fire at 8,000 feet. He bailed out and landed in Japanese-controlled territory near Maiktala. Local troops captured him within 2 hours. The Japanese flew him to Singapore for interrogation before sending him on to Japan. Melton spent 3 days in the Singapore facility. Though kept mostly isolated, he managed brief conversations during exercise periods. He recognized Bagot immediately from intelligence briefings back in India. Every unit in the theater knew about the March 31st mission to Pinmana. What Melton told Bagot changed everything. During his interrogation in Burma, a Japanese colonel had spoken about the incident. He described it with a mixture of respect and disbelief. An American airman, hanging from a parachute, had fired at a Ki-43 pilot. The fighter had crashed. Recovery teams found the wreckage in the jungle. The pilot had been thrown clear on impact. His body lay 200 yards from the crash site. There was no uncertainty, no doubt. The Japanese knew the truth. Bagot had not imagined it. He had done the impossible. The Japanese colonel had been precise about the cause of death. It was a single gunshot wound to the head. He had emphasized that detail deliberately. The Ki-43 pilot had not died in the crash. He was already dead before his fighter struck the trees. The .45 caliber round had entered the left side of the pilot's face and exited behind his right ear. The pilot never recovered from the stall. The aircraft began its final spin with no one alive at the controls. When Colonel Harry Melton told Bagot this, there was no doubt left. The impossible thing had happened exactly as Bagot remembered it. For seconds. For shots. One hit that mattered. Melton promised to file an official report once he returned to Allied lines. He wanted the incident documented. The Army Air Forces needed to know that one of their officers had achieved something unprecedented in aerial combat, a confirmed kill with a sidearm while hanging beneath a parachute canopy. No escort. No formation. Just a man, a pistol, and perfect timing. But Melton never made that report. On December 14th, Japanese guards loaded Melton and 47 other prisoners onto a transport ship bound for the Japanese home islands. The vessel sailed north through the South China Sea, unescorted. By late 1943, American submarines dominated those waters. The Japanese gambled on speed and luck. They lost. At 0300 hours on December 17th, the USS Celian detected the transport. From 2,200 yards, the submarine fired 4 torpedoes. 3 struck home. The ship broke apart and sank in 11 minutes. Survivors scrambled into lifeboats. They drifted for 2 days before a Japanese destroyer found them. The destroyer did not rescue them. Its crew machine-gunned the lifeboats. Everyone was killed except one British officer, who survived by hiding beneath the bodies of the dead until the destroyer departed. That officer later reached Allied lines. He confirmed Colonel Melton's death to the United States War Department. He also carried something else, a letter Melton had written to his wife while imprisoned in Singapore. In it, Melton described an American airman who had done something extraordinary over Burma, something the Japanese themselves could barely believe. But the official report, the formal documentation of Baggett's pistol shot, died with Melton in the South China Sea. What remained were fragments, a second-hand account, a letter, and rumors that moved quietly through prisoner-of-war camps across Southeast Asia. Baggett stayed in the Singapore camp through the winter of 1944. By March, his weight had fallen to 110 pounds. His ribs protruded sharply beneath his skin. His teeth loosened from scurvy. His legs trembled when he stood. The daily ration was 1 cup of rice and a thin soup made from vegetable scraps. Twice a week, guards issued a small piece of dried fish. Protein meant survival. Prisoners fought over fish heads and chicken feet when guards discarded kitchen waste. Men measured life in mouthfuls. Baggett ate slowly. He was determined to last. The work details were worse than the hunger. Japanese engineers used prisoner labor to construct airfield defenses around Singapore, revetments, blast walls, and anti-aircraft positions built from crushed coral and stone. Baggett spent 6 months hauling loads that should have required machinery. 12 hours a day. Temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The guards beat anyone who slowed. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion, dysentery, or simple starvation. Some were dragged aside. Some were left where they fell. The work did not stop. By November 1944, American B-29 superfortresses began striking targets around Singapore. The raids came at night. From his cell, Baggett watched searchlights stab upward and flak burst like white blossoms against the clouds. Bombs fell on docks and oil facilities 3 miles from the prison, close enough to feel the concussions, close enough to hope. By January 1945, Baggett's weight had fallen to 90 pounds. He could no longer walk without help. The beriberi had progressed to the point where his legs failed after only a few minutes upright. His heart raced constantly. His hands shook. Jensen helped him to the latrine and back. Other prisoners shared what little they could spare. An Australian sergeant once slipped Baggett half a lime, stolen from a guard's lunch. The vitamin C may have saved his life. As the war turned against Japan, the guards grew nervous. Germany surrendered in May. American forces captured Okinawa in June. B-29s burned Japanese cities night after night. The guards stopped pretending victory was possible. Some spoke openly about executing all prisoners if American forces landed in Malaya. Others talked about forced marches into the jungle, men abandoned to die once they were too weak to continue. On August 6th, a single B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki was destroyed. Baggett heard the news from a guard who looked genuinely shaken. There was no boasting, no threats, only fear. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. The guards simply walked away. They left the gates open and disappeared into Singapore. The prisoners stayed where they were. No one knew whether the surrender was real or a ruse to justify killing anyone who tried to leave. They waited. On September 21st, 8 men parachuted into the compound at dawn. They were OSS operatives sent to locate and evacuate Allied prisoners before Japanese holdouts or insurgents could interfere. They brought medical supplies, food, and radios. They documented conditions. They began organizing evacuations to India and Australia. 38 men were judged too weak to survive immediate transport. Baggett was one of them. The medics established an aid station inside the camp and began treating the worst cases of malnutrition and disease. For the first time in nearly 3 years, Baggett received proper care. On September 28, a C-47 landed at Cowling Airport. The aircraft carried doctors and supplies. 4 hours later, it departed with 18 prisoners aboard. Baggett was among them. After 917 days in Japanese captivity, he was finally going home. And he carried a story almost no one would believe. The C-47 flew Baggett to Kolkata, where Army doctors examined him on October 1, 1945. Their assessment was blunt: severe malnutrition, beriberi, chronic dysentery, dental damage from scurvy, multiple parasitic infections. They estimated 6 months would be required before he was strong enough to return to the United States. Baggett spent 3 weeks in the Kolkata Field Hospital before being transferred to a rehabilitation facility in Karachi, where treatment continued under better conditions. Food came regularly, clean water, medication. The weight began to return slowly. In November, the debriefings began. Army Air Forces intelligence officers interviewed every recovered prisoner in detail. They wanted camp locations, guard routines, interrogation methods, names of officers, anything that could support future war crimes trials or improve survival training for air crews still flying combat missions. Baggett gave them everything he remembered about Rangoon and Singapore. Names, layouts, dates, beatings, starvation, labor details. The officers typed carefully. His testimony would later be used in post-war investigations. Then Baggett mentioned the key 43 over Pinmanna. The room changed. The officers asked him to repeat the story. Then again. Then they began asking precise questions. How far away was the fighter? What was its airspeed? What was the aircraft's attitude? How many rounds did he fire? Could he confirm the crash? The questions came quickly, professionally. Not hostile, skeptical. Baggett answered as accurately as he could. He described the pilot leaning out of the cockpit, the fighter hanging on the edge of a stall, the 4 shots, the spin, the disappearance into jungle. The officers exchanged looks. They had heard thousands of combat claims during the war. Some were accurate. Some were exaggerated. Some were attempts by survivors to impose meaning on chaos and loss. They needed corroboration. Baggett had none. Jensen had been too far away to see the engagement. Crossstick was already on the ground. The rest of the crew was dead. Colonel Melton, who knew the truth, had been killed at sea. There was no gun camera footage. No wreckage recovery. No Japanese records accessible. The Key 43 had crashed in enemy-controlled jungle. There was no physical evidence and no surviving witness besides Baggett himself. The intelligence officers documented his claim but made no recommendation. The report was filed, one statement among thousands collected from returning prisoners. No investigation followed. No inquiry was opened. The story disappeared into a filing cabinet at Army Air Forces headquarters. Baggett returned to the United States in February 1946, landing at San Francisco. He processed through separation facilities at the Presidio, where doctors conducted final examinations. His weight had climbed back to 145 pounds. The beriberi had mostly resolved. The dysentery was under control. He still had nightmares. Still flinched at sudden noise. Still woke expecting guards. But he was functional. The doctors cleared him for continued service. Baggett chose to stay in the military. The Army Air Forces became the United States Air Force in September 1947, and Baggett transferred without ceremony. He returned to flying, not bombers this time, but transports. In 1948, he flew supply missions during the Berlin airlift, threading cargo aircraft through narrow air corridors into a besieged city. The work was demanding but methodical. No gunfire. No fighters. Just precision, weather, and fatigue. During the Korean War, Baggett served in Japan as a squadron operations officer. He planned missions, managed crews, solved logistical problems. Promotions followed steadily, not for heroics, but for competence. He was reliable, calm under pressure, the kind of officer commanders trusted. No one asked him about Pinmanna. The war was over. Everyone wanted to move forward. By 1953, Baggett was a major, 11 years into his career. The nightmares had faded. though they never vanished completely. Some memories loosen their grip with time. Others simply wait. Occasionally, the story surfaced. A fellow officer might learn Baggett had been a prisoner of war and ask how he'd been shot down. Baggett would answer briefly. Sometimes the question followed, the parachute incident. He told it plainly. No embellishment. No drama. Most listeners reacted with polite skepticism. The story sounded implausible. Too clean. Too cinematic. Real combat, they believed, didn't work that way. Baggett didn't argue. He had no proof. No surviving witnesses. No official confirmation. Just a debriefing report filed decades earlier that concluded nothing. With time, even his own certainty had softened. He knew what he'd seen. He knew the fighter had fallen. Whether the bullets killed the pilot or the aircraft crashed for some other reason, he could no longer say with absolute certainty. 30 years changes memory. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in 1961, colonel in 1968. He commanded a transport squadron at Mitchell Air Force Base in New York. His performance reviews were consistent. Strong leadership, disciplined operations, low accident rates. He ran tight organizations. Maintenance standards were high. Crews were prepared. Mistakes were corrected quietly and early. He mentored junior officers. Sponsored children through the Commander for a Day program. Built a reputation as a professional who delivered results without spectacle. Baggett retired from the Air Force in 1973, at age 53, after 29 years of service. He had survived the Burma camps, flown through the Berlin airlift, served during Korea, helped build the post-war Air Force into a modern institution. He settled in San Antonio, Texas, and took a job as a defense contractor manager. The work was quieter but familiar. Aviation still mattered to him. His wife knew about Pinmanna. A few close friends did as well. But Baggett rarely spoke of it. The story felt like it belonged to someone else, a 22-year-old co-pilot, bleeding and hanging beneath a parachute over Burma. That man was difficult to reconcile with the grandfather living quietly in Texas. The war had been over for decades. Most people didn't want to hear about it anymore. In July 1996, more than half a century after the war, Air Force magazine published an article titled Valor, David and Goliath. For the first time, Owen Baggett's account was examined publicly, not as rumor, not as anecdote, but as a historical problem to be analyzed. The author reviewed Japanese operational records, interviewed surviving members of the 7th Bomb Group, and reconstructed the tactical situation over Pinmanna on March 31, 1943. The article did not rely on emotion or legend. It asked a simple question. Could this have happened? The conclusion was careful and decisive. There were no Allied fighters operating in that sector of Burma that day. Any Japanese aircraft lost in the area had to be explained by other means. The key, 43 Oscars low stall speed made extremely close maneuvering possible. A 45 caliber round at a distance of 20 feet was unquestionably lethal. At altitude, with little margin for recovery, even a brief loss of control would have been fatal. The account attributed to Colonel Harry Melton, secondhand, but from a credible source, matched Japanese casualty reporting. The Japanese themselves had acknowledged the incident. The magazine's assessment was clear. There was no reasonable alternative explanation. Baggett's account was credible. The article brought renewed attention. Military historians reached out. Aviation magazines requested interviews. Television producers called. At 76 years old, Baggett found himself explaining Pinmanna to people who had never heard of the Burma campaign, never studied the 7th Bomb Group, never imagined aerial combat fought at such margins. He answered questions plainly. For shots. One falling aircraft. 53 years of uncertainty. He never dramatized the event. He never claimed certainty beyond what he knew. He had spent most of his life unsure whether history would ever catch up with that moment. Owen Baggett died on July 27, 2006, at his home in New Braunfels, Texas. He was 85 years old. His obituary noted his Air Force career, his time as a prisoner of war, and his work with children after retirement. It also recorded a remarkable distinction. He was believed to be the only individual in military history to shoot down an enemy aircraft with a handgun while descending by parachute. The weapon was a Colt M1911, standard issue for American pilots for decades. Designed in 1911 by John Browning, it carried 7 rounds of .45 caliber ammunition. Reliable in mud, sand, water, and extreme heat. Tens of thousands of airmen carried it into combat during World War II. Only one ever used it that way. The story strains belief because the conditions were so exact. The fighter had to approach within pistol range. The pilot had to slow to near-stall speed. The canopy had to be open. The parachutist had to remain conscious, wounded, and capable of accurate fire, all within a window of seconds. The odds were astronomical. But astronomical odds are not the same as impossibility. Baggett's experience reflects something fundamental about air combat in World War II. The men who fought that war operated at the limits of human endurance. They flew aircraft pushed beyond design margins. They fought at altitudes that dulled thought and sharpened fear. They watched friends die in ways that still defy comprehension. And sometimes, survival depended on decisions made in seconds, actions that seemed irrational until they worked. The Burma campaign remains one of the least recognized theaters of the war. The 7th Bomb Group flew missions as dangerous as those over Germany, often without adequate escort, navigating by dead reckoning over jungle with no landmarks and no margin for error. By war's end, 30% of its crews were killed, captured, or missing. Baggett's story is not only his own. It represents the courage of men who fought far from headlines, under conditions few would survive, and whose sacrifices were largely forgotten. Until, finally, history caught up.